4 days on from the inception of Operation Epic Fury, joint strikes by the USA and Israel and Iran, which started on the 28th of February, the conflict shows no signs of de-escalating. Iran has retaliated with strikes on all GCC states, including Oman. Hezbollah fired rockets into Israel, and Israel has subsequently initiated a heavy bombardment of strikes in southern Lebanon and deployed IDF forces on the ground with the stated intent of creating a buffer zone between North Israel and Lebanon. I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of CMEC, and this evening I'm speaking to the award-winning journalist Gareth Browne, Middle East correspondent with The Economist, who is speaking from Dubai. Gareth, hello.
Good evening.
Events are moving fast. Can you give an update of where, from where you are this evening in Dubai, this being the evening of the 3rd of March, 2026?
Yeah, I think today in Dubai specifically, things have been quiet. We've had, 3 quite turbulent days of drones being fired from Iran, of ballistic missiles being intercepted, above the city, general targeting of civilian sites in the UAE, across the Gulf. And, as someone who spends a lot of time in Dubai, I'm always passing in and out. It's jarring. It's a city that sort of has staked its image, its reputation on security and being this little oasis of stability. And I think if there was some sort of novelty to it in the first few days, it's starting to wear off now with a lot of people, particularly tourists and people who were sort of caught in transit. Obviously, there's a huge British population living in the UAE, almost 300,000 people. And on top of that, probably 70,000 British travelers who have got stuck here as a result of the conflict. And obviously, it's a big topic in the media back home, trying to evacuate these people or what's going to happen to these people. I think, a lot of the people who live in Dubai are sort of waiting it out. They don't have a choice. But you speak to the tourists and they're really sort of starting to get fed up, and it's no longer a kind of extra few days in paradise, but they can't get home. And to be honest, the airport did open for a few hours yesterday and a few flights did get out, but given the missile interceptions that I've heard, sitting right here about an hour ago, the airspace is just too volatile, and it seems unlikely that sort of Dubai and Dubai's airspace is going to return to normal anytime soon.
Dubai is notoriously, and the Emirates as a whole, but Dubai in particular is notoriously a melting pot. Have you had a chance to speak to other nationalities, other people in Dubai, stranded in Dubai, all facing the same threats from the sky?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in the last week trying to speak to Iranians here. There's a huge Iranian population here, 700,000 Iranians living in the UAE. And, it's really not far away. If you go to the north of the Emirates, you're really, a very short flight, a 1-hour flight away from Iran. I think it's the Iranian population in the UAE is quite interesting because, unlike other diaspora populations, especially ones in the West, in Los Angeles, for example, or in the UK, you tend to get a far greater mix of views here. So, yeah, you will have some people who are monarchists and support. There tends to be a lot of the Iranians in the Western world. But also you'll have people who have been going back and forth to Iran all the time. So some of them are sympathetic to the regime. Some of them are supporters of the Islamic Republic, and others are sort of, I guess, ambivalent, but they go back regularly. So they understand the regime. They deal with it. They interact with it. The sort of general sense is people are quite nervous. It hasn't been easy, to speak to them and to get those people talking and tell me about, their relatives back home or how they think things are going to go. But, there's a little sort of cross-section of Iranian society in the UAE. And obviously, speaking to people actually in the country is so difficult with the internet down and general sort of climate of fear that it's sort of the next best thing in some regards.
And it may well be hard to say, but have you got a sense of how further up the hierarchy the Gulf state leaders are feeling? Is there a mood for retaliation, or is the mood, let's do anything to de-escalate and keep everything calm?
Yeah, I think the GCC positions have been one of the most dramatic things that have shifted in the last few days. Before and when this war broke out, there was definitely a Gulf sense of de-escalation. Oman was mediating the talks, and if you look at Qatar and the UAE in particular, they'd spent quite a lot of political capital, one on trying to, do diplomacy with the Iranians, but on economic issues as well. And there's definitely a willingness to sort of cooperate with Iran, despite whatever ideological differences there were. I think all of that has changed. Iran has essentially lashed out at the GCC states, all of them. It's attacked Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and even Oman, which just a few days ago was moderating peace talks. And, you're seeing really quite, maybe not physically devastating attacks, but reputationally devastating and image shattering attacks on vital interests in the GCC. So we've seen Iranian attacks on energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, on oil fields, and on LNG production facilities in Qatar. Now, yesterday, the Qataris closed this key LNG facility, which I understand provides about 40% of the LNG that goes to the UK. So this is like really, really serious territory. This is not for show. We've seen them hitting Dubai airport and the airport in Kuwait as well. And these are all things which are really badly damaging the Gulf's image of stability and security, and frankly, are scaring people. And I think, especially in the last 2 or 3 days, I have sensed a coalescing of the Gulf position. And that idea of trying to accommodate Iran, that's gone. That's an idea from a week ago, which doesn't really apply anymore. I think increasingly the Gulf states are coalescing around this position where they have to push back. Aggressive defense is one of the sort of terms you hear them using. And I understand that there's now talks going on in some of the Gulf states about what that might look like. It could be some sort of, it could be as simple as allowing the US to use Gulf airspace and Gulf air bases for their aerial attacks on Iran proper. It could be a sort of more assertive posture across the Gulf. We could even see GCC states attacking Iranian targets on the ground, missile launches and things like that. I really think that's possible. I think there is a general sort of consensus in the Gulf that this threat from Iran cannot be allowed to continue. And, Iran has set a new precedent in the last few days, right? And that when it's under assault, it can take out its anger and frustrations on the Gulf by attacking energy facilities or airports or tourist sites, whatever. And that's just a precedent that the Gulf states cannot allow. It undermines their raison d'etre. And so you're stuck. I think if you're the Gulf states, you're stuck with a dilemma. Do you sort of sue for peace, knowing that you live under this precedent that an Iranian drone could come at any time and attack the airport in Abu Dhabi or in Dubai or the Burj Khalifa? Or do you put a stop to this and actually, set a new precedent yourself by going on the offensive? And I think that's when you sort of put the dilemma like that, it's very clear what the Gulf states see that they need to do and what they will do.
Is there I'm going to ask you a question that's maybe impossible to answer, and it's very generalized. Is there a sense of anger at Netanyahu and Trump for Operation Epic Fury, which has instigated Iran's retaliation? Or is there a feeling that Iran has been a problem to the Sunni-ruled Gulf states for a long time, and this is simply old tensions re-emerging, and it was kind of inevitable?
I would certainly say on the first day of the war, there was a lot of anger towards the US and Israel, Netanyahu in particular. But I think within 24 hours, that anger had shifted to anger at the Iranian regime. I had a conversation with a pretty senior Qatari last night who really surprised me. He used the words treachery when he was describing the Iranian attacks. He said, "This is treachery." And he also said, and I'm quoting here, he said that I find this really difficult to say, but the Iranians are proving the Americans and the Israelis right, that all along the Islamic Republic could never be trusted. And to hear that from a Qatari, very smart, very plugged in, was quite stark. I think we're going to see, within days, Gulf participation in what the US and Israel are doing in some form.
Turning to the Sunni Shia aspect of it, of course, Khameini was not only the most significant figure in Iran as supreme leader, but also a very significant figure for the religion, the faith of Shia Islam. How has his assassination affected the Shia communities across the Gulf and into Iraq?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the Gulf, we have Bahrain, which obviously has a very significant Shia population. And when the Arab Spring erupted, there were most certainly protests happening in Bahrain, and some of the Shia in Bahrain were Khomeinists, others followed other clerics, but that was always a big concern for Saudi Arabia and for the Bahraini government. And I think we're seeing seeds of domestic unrest in Bahrain. Snippets, bits and pieces coming out on social media. I think Iraq, it sort of remains to be seen which way the kind of Shia community at large are going to go, because obviously Iraq has a competing religious authority there in Ayatollah Sistani, who was always the trading places with Khamenei to be the kind of prime Shia cleric in the world. Now, the Shia militias in Iraq have so far been very vocal, and there's been a lot of saber rattling, and we saw some attempted marches on the US embassy in the Green Zone last night. And we've seen rocket attacks and assaults, drone attacks, things like that on, the US consulate in Erbil and the US military base in Erbil. So the Shia militias, some of them are making a lot of noise, but they're not going all in on Iran's behalf. That's really noticeable. And I'm also not convinced that it's sort of representative of a wider Shia sentiment. I think there's plenty of Shia, even religious Shia, who recognize how troublesome for Iran and the IRGC's meddling has been over the last 20 years. And I had messages from religious Shia Iraqis who were very happy when Khamenei was taken out on the first day of the operation. So I think it remains to be seen how much weight, how much leverage do these Shia militias, some of which are loyal to Iran, many of which are deeply embedded in the Iraqi state, actually have. I think that's one thing that's going to play out in the next week or two. I think most interestingly has been the reaction in Lebanon. Now, obviously, Lebanon, significant Shia population, and also home to the crown jewel in the axis of resistance, Iran's star proxy, and that's Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah made the decision yesterday to fire what I would say was quite a pathetic salvo of rockets at Israel. And they did this despite very explicit direct and indirect warnings from both the Lebanese government and Israel not to do so. The Lebanese prime minister said, Lebanon doesn't need to be dragged into this war. We don't want to be dragged into other people's adventures. The Israelis had reportedly given a list of targets of civilian infrastructure to the Lebanese government, saying, if Hezbollah fire a rocket at us, this is what we're going to destroy. And I think there's a real sense in Lebanon that this country did not want to be dragged into another war. It's limping out of that port explosion, the financial crisis, 5-6 years ago, the war between Israel and Hezbollah. 18 months ago, the South still hasn't been rebuilt. Maybe you can hear the interceptors going above me. And so despite all these warnings, Hezbollah has pulled the country into this war. And I think the Israelis were only too happy for that. I think the Israelis had this big plan. And I think from an Israeli perspective, now this is the time to end Hezbollah once and for all. So we're hearing about, really widespread, over 400 people killed in airstrikes in Lebanon in the last 48 hours. So it's a massively violent part of the conflict. But for all of the, for everything I've just said about the intensity of that Israeli offensive on Hezbollah in Lebanon, it seems that Hezbollah have committed political suicide. And actually the reckoning they're going to face is going to be at the hands of the Lebanese public and the Lebanese government. So shortly after that kind of pathetic salvo of rockets was fired yesterday, the Lebanese government held this extraordinary cabinet meeting, and they came out and basically determined that all military and security activities by Hezbollah are now illegal. They didn't declare Hezbollah illegal, but they said anything they're doing related to security is illegal. This is huge words, but it could just be empty words. So I think, this was essentially Hezbollah committing suicide, political suicide, by deciding to enter the war. It's only 18 months since their entire leadership and control and command was wiped out, including Hassan Nasrallah. And here they are dragging not just themselves, but the country into another round of war. And, the Israeli onslaught on Lebanon has been ferocious already in the last 48 hours. over 400 people killed. But I think the gravest concern now for Hezbollah is going to be the Lebanese public and the Lebanese government. So shortly after they fired off that salvo of rockets, we saw an extraordinary cabinet meeting from the Lebanese government where they came out and determined that the group's security and military activities were now illegal. And the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Nawaf Salam, gave the order for the army to go and disarm the group. And this is the strongest sort of stance the Lebanese government has ever taken about Hezbollah. I mean, it's just an unthinkable thing for a Lebanese Prime Minister to say, even 6 months ago, 12 months ago. I mean, the cynics were sort of suggesting, well, this is just words and nothing changes. But just an hour ago, it was reported on the Lebanese news that the army had arrested 12 armed Hezbollah fighters attempting to go to the south. Now, if that is to continue, then perhaps we've seen a very sort of drastic change in the willingness of the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army to confront Hezbollah. For years, I mean, I remember this when I was a student of the Middle East back in 2012 at university, and the understanding was that the Lebanese army could never possibly confront Hezbollah. And now I think it's flipped. I don't think Hezbollah can afford to confront the Lebanese army. And so the airstrikes are very intense, and more than 50,000 people have fled their homes. But I think the real reckoning for Hezbollah is going to come at the hands of the Lebanese state now and the Lebanese government.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm talking to Gareth Browne, Middle East correspondent with The Economist, who is speaking from Dubai. Gareth, can we go a bit further afield than simply the Gulf Peninsula? What role are the Kurds playing in this, both historically and now?
So there's more than 20 million Kurds in Iran, and one of the largest minority groups in the country. And I think you're seeing real movement there in the last few days. Iraqi Kurdistan has for years hosted a number of Iranian Kurdish rebel groups. And then in the last few days following the start of the offensive, 5 of the biggest Kurdish Iranian groups came out and basically announced a merger, which was, important. I think these groups are untested. These are not like the SDF in Syria or the Peshmerga in Iraq. They haven't really been trained or well supplied by the US or equipped by the CIA or anything like that. It's a much more sort of rudimentary rebel force. But we've seen, I guess, some legitimization of the movements of the groups from the US administration. And Trump had a phone call with some Iraqi Kurdish leaders in the last few days, and he's reportedly spoken directly to the Iranian Kurds. I think been speaking to some of these people involved in these groups, and they think this is their time. And if we couple that with, we're seeing very fierce US and Israeli airstrikes in the Kurdish regions of Iran. And essentially, it looks like an effort to push the IRGC, push the government forces away from the border, and perhaps allow some sort of opening where these Iranian Kurdish rebel groups based in Iraq can cross into the country and maybe sort of establish some sort of autonomous administration or area. When Trump and other senior figures in his administration have talked about their sort of strategy for Iran, Trump has sort of fallen back on hoping someone internal might take over. And that hasn't really materialized yet. Early days, of course, but it does seem that another part of that strategy is encouraging some sort of Kurdish uprising. Maybe this is history repeating itself. I think it's important to note that when we talk about the Iranian Kurdish groups, they're not the 5 key ones, which I mentioned, are not secessionist groups. They're not trying to establish an independent Kurdistan in Iran. They're more focused on sort of building a secular and democratic Iranian state. So they differ from the Kurdish groups in other countries in the region. But this is, potentially hugely destabilizing for Iran. As I'm sure you can imagine, Turkey won't be happy about this if they are to sort of carve out some sort of autonomous region. But if we're looking at Iranian state capacity and state unity, I think those Kurdish regions in the northwest along the Iraqi border are probably the first area where it's going to start to fail. And if it looks like the regime is going to fail or crumble, it'll happen first in the Kurdish areas. And so it's very important to pay attention to what these groups are doing. And if we start to see reports that they're getting weapons from the CIA or being trained by the US military or even by other Iraqi Kurdish groups, then that would be, I think, confirmation that they're going to play a key part in Trump's strategy, whatever that is.
So 3 actors, 2 of them state and 1 not state, that we haven't heard or seen very much action from since the 28th of February. One is the non-state actor, the Houthis, who remain an Iranian proxy, a formidable Iranian proxy to be reckoned with. Turkey, which you've just mentioned, and then China, which will have interests in stability in the region, I'm guessing. Have you any predictions as to what those factors may be about to do or maybe thinking as a collective?
On the Chinese front, I think that China has probably made a decision that Iran is not an ally worth saving. It's not strategically important, especially compared to the Gulf. I mean, don't forget, there's a huge amount of Chinese capital in the Gulf, Chinese energy relationships with the Gulf. Like, honestly, it's hard to see China choosing Iran over its relationships with the GCC. Let's put it that way. I think the Houthis are the beast that is asleep at the minute. And I think they have probably actually, interestingly, ideologically speaking, they're less sort of aligned with the IRGC and with the Iranian mothership than Hezbollah were. But they've probably been more disruptive and effective at what the Iranians hoped they would do in the last 2 years, disrupting global shipping, firing rockets at southern Israel. They've been very effective. And they haven't woken up yet. I think that the Houthis have come to quite an accommodating agreement with Saudi Arabia, when the Saudis pushed the UAE out of Yemen in December. And I think that's reflective of a dilemma that a lot of these groups, proxies, partners, whatever you want to call them, have, where really now you're being forced to decide, if you're one of these groups, are you going to go down with the ship? Are you that committed to the IRGC's cause, the Islamic Revolution? Or are you more interested in maintaining the wealth and power that you've accumulated over however many years? And, this is a question that all of these are going through. And I think the Houthis have decided that, perhaps this isn't a hill we want to die on, and we'd rather sort of maintain our primacy within Yemen. On the other side of that, the Hezbollah leadership seem to have decided, that there is absolute ideological alignment with the IRGC, and they will go down with that ship. So, each of these sort of proxies has a different decision to make, and some of them are more ideologically aligned, some of them are less ideologically aligned. On the Turkish front, Turkey has been quiet, and I think the thing that will wake up Turkey is the Kurdish issue. So something we saw was, like, after this call between Trump and the Kurdish leaders in Iraq, one of these 5 groups is affiliated to the PKK, which remains an outlawed group in Turkey, was a call from Hakan Fidan and a public statements from him. So I don't think Turkey has a huge role to play in Iran just yet, but that could change drastically. And I think one of the places that could unfold is Iraq. You could see a Turkish invasion of Sinjar, of some of the Kurdish areas of northern Iraq, if somehow a sort of Kurdish region develops in Iran in the coming weeks. So several of those beasts you just named are sleeping, but that could change. They could wake up, and then the whole sort of equation becomes a lot more complicated.
And finally, do you see any route for de-escalation in this, or is it going to get worse before anything begins to get better?
No, I don't think there's any route for de-escalation. I think the Iranian regime has begun a process of collapse. And I don't think that, let me justify that. I believe that the Iranian regime has begun a process of collapse. And I don't point to the assassinations, the loss of command and control. They're taking huge military losses, of course. But actually, I think it's something a lot more concerning from their perspective. When the Iranians met with the US in Geneva for these sort of last-ditch peace efforts, having spoken to people sort of on the fringes of those talks, it became clear to me that the Iranians were sort of getting stuck into the detail of the JCPOA in 2015. And the Americans sort of said, we're not here to this is not 2015. This is not what we're negotiating. What are you thinking? So that's example one. The Iranians went into the talks in Geneva, and their strategic judgment just completely failed. which is why I think those talks were never going to work. I would add that we've talked a lot about the decision by Iran to lash out at the Gulf states. Now, clearly, the Iranians thought that by causing pain in the Gulf states would run to the Trump administration and beg him to stop the war. That was the Iranian strategy. And the opposite's happening. Absolutely. So that's another massive failure in strategic judgment. So one of the reasons why I think this regime is now going to collapse is that its judgment is just shot. Its ability to act and think strategically is completely failing. And if that's happening on an international level, imagine these failings internally. All the bad choices being made by inexperienced or stressed out commanders on the ground. And I would just add to that, I don't think you should underestimate the sort of ideological steadfastness of the Iranian regime. I think there is a great deal of people in the regime in Tehran who would rather die fighting than give up anything. And, I think the Trump administration sort of feels like it's winning. It's taking out so many senior figures, and I'm not sure it feels any pressure to stop. So why would it? So I think we're going to be in this conflict for many, many weeks. And whatever the government and state in Iran looks like at the end of it is going to be drastically different to the one we had, a week ago.
Gareth Browne speaking from Dubai. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Charlotte.